Good afternoon, everybody. It is a privilege to be here in Panama City Beach with the men and women of the United States Coast Guard. The issue of seafood and our testing and making sure that it's safe, and we are all over that and monitoring that carefully each and every day, hopefully continuing to deliver good news as the days goes on.
I just want to make one observation, which I'll be going into in the questions, and that is with respect to the use of chemical dispersants. We are treating chemicals with chemicals which don't actually remove or clean up the oil. They simply shift them to another part of the ecosystem while increasing the toxins in the Gulf, harming marine life, contaminating the water column, and threatening human life. And there is no scientific evidence that dispersants can be effective in an oil spill of this magnitude. But these chemicals make it harder to track how much oil is there and where it's going, and thus to determine liability. They are good for public relations, but nobody can guarantee they are safe. Already we're hearing of people getting sick because of the use of these chemicals. In fact, there's already anecdotal evidence that people are getting sick from the mixture of oil and toxic dispersants. We are basically airdropping this toxic stuff all over the Gulf. It reminds me of Agent Orange, and I'm greatly concerned that during this cleanup, we are conducting an uncontrolled experiment with all the marine and human life in the Gulf Coast region, and an uncontrolled experiment that could result in thousands and thousands of people getting sick or dying as a result of the cleanup, not of the original disaster. And I'll be going into questions on that during the question period, and I hope that we can prevent a repetition of some of the disasters that we've had before. This disaster is unprecedented in scope as it is, and I fear we're just going to make it worse.
New findings, preliminary findings that reveal that those orange droplets found in tens of thousands of tiny blue crab larvae are characteristic of the controversial oil dispersants.
New findings back up the concern the dispersant BP used so widely may do more harm than the oil itself.
I was more concerned about the Corexit than the oil also.
Now, researchers say it appears they've detected a Corexit sort of fingerprint in these orange blobs found lodged in the bodies of tiny blue crab larvae collected from marshes that stretch from Texas to Florida.
We're at unprecedented volumes of dispersant used so far.
And that's what UNO's Martin O'Connell, who studies aquatic organisms that move through the water, says is the problem, that the volume of the EPA's pre-approved dispersant used to break down the oil probably turned it into small droplets, making it easy to find its way under a shell.
Something like with a shell, a small shell, a shrimp or a crab, it kind of gets stuck in some places, and if they can survive the actual toxicity.
He says with Corexit, no one really knows.
If you're a small fish and you eat 1,000 of these crab larvae and all of them have oil or Corexit drops in them, they could get into the fish, that little fish could be eaten, and so on and so on.
New Orleans attorneys representing fishermen and cleanup workers who have left boats because they're sick have hired experts to test air and water quality samples. A toxicologist out of Florida found that some of these chemicals are in great excess of risk-based lethal levels, that the current hydrocarbon levels are capable of sterilizing our fisheries and estuary production zones. Because so many fish and crabs feed on crab larvae, some scientists fear the oil and dispersant droplets threaten to kill critical areas in the Gulf food web.
First and foremost, we're going to continue to monitor and remove any oil that reaches the surface and clean up any oil that hits the shore. As a result of the massive cleanup operation that's already taken place, a recent report by our top scientists found that the majority of oil has now evaporated or dispersed. Now evaporated or dispersed. Now evaporated or dispersed. Or it's been burned, skimmed, or recovered from the wellhead. And the dispersed oil is in the process of degrading.
We should understand that vast areas are still suffering from this internal bleeding of the toxic chemicals and oil that have been put into the ocean by BP. Are still suffering from this internal bleeding of the toxic chemicals and oil.
I also want to point out that as a result of the cleanup effort, beaches all along the Gulf Coast are clean, they are safe, clean, they are safe, clean, they are safe, and they are open for business. That's one of the reasons Michelle, Sasha, and I are here.
Are still suffering from this internal bleeding of the toxic chemicals and oil are still suffering from this internal bleeding of the toxic chemicals and oil.
And for the most part, the water looks okay. While it may be tempting to take a quick dip, you may think twice after seeing this report. It's a News 5 investigation testing the waters. We want to get a sample just over here where there are people actually in the water.
Our News 5 investigation took us from Gulf Shores to Orange Beach, to Katrina Key, to the Dolphin Island Marina. We collected samples of water, sand, and when we saw kids digging...
Do you mind if we get some water out of your sand hole here?
We got a sample of that, too. To our eye, the water looked pretty normal until we took those samples to a lab.
When testing for oil or grease, how much would be normal on the beach?
I wouldn't think that you'd find very much on the beach. There's no real normal amount. Normal is non-detected.
Bob Naiman is a chemist with nearly 30 years of experience. He tested our water and sand for oil and petroleum. Naiman says he wouldn't expect to see any more than 5 parts per million of the greasy stuff. But when he started testing the water, this is what he found. The first sample, taken just off Katrina Key, tested positive for more than 3 times that, 16 parts per million of oil and petroleum. The second sample was water from Orange Beach. Here we saw light sheen, and the test confirmed, coming back with 29 parts per million. In Gulf Shores, we came across some kids digging in the sand, some 20 yards from any waves.
You mind if I get a sample of your water?
But even there, the sample came back 51 parts per million. The numbers keep getting higher. Gulf Shores beach water, right where people were swimming, showed 66 parts per million. And the sand, where beachgoers are walking, has 211 parts per million. The sixth sample was a spot in Orange Beach where, again, we found kids playing. And we found our highest content of oil and petroleum, 221 parts per million. But the tests didn't stop there. The sample we haven't yet told you about is the one collected from Dolphin Island Marina, near some boom, which we can only imagine's been handled by cleanup workers. When Naiman added an organic solvent to separate the oil from the water, just like he did with all the other samples, this sample exploded right in his lab.
I mean, like almost instantaneous. Actually, maybe 1 second. It's just weird.
The results surprised even our chemist.
We think that it most likely happened due to the presence of either methanol or methane gas or the presence of the dispersant Corexit.
Unfortunately, the sample was destroyed in the explosion, so we'll have to get more and do a different kind of test to get to the bottom of what's in it.
There are 2 things that we can take away from the test we did. First, even if you don't see oil on the beach or in the water, chances are it's there. All of our tests from Orange Beach to Dolphin Island showed an abnormal presence of oil. And second, while we don't know exactly what caused that Dolphin Island Marina sample to explode, it has certainly caught our interest. News 5 will test that water for chemicals, specifically chemicals linked to the dispersant being used in the Gulf, Corexit.
Next, we're going to continue testing fisheries, and we'll be reopening more areas for fishing as tests show that the waters are safe.
Oyster fishermen are alarmed at what they're finding in Elwha Bay, an area that once again is open to fishing. This afternoon, they showed us the disturbing state of oysters from beds that once provided their livelihoods. Liz Reyes has that story.
Well, the private oyster grounds we visited is about a 45-minute boat ride southeast of Wyclowski. And the fishermen we spoke to say state officials need to re-examine some of these grounds which have officially been reopened.
See the blackness in there? That's not normal.
Black-brown slime is what Corky Robin is finding on oysters dredged from waters in Elwha Bay. That's southeast of Wyclowski. These are waters which have provided oysters for his family's seafood business for almost 70 years.
It could be oil. It's a mixture of oil. It's probably a mixture of oil and disbursement and whatever.
The oysters are from a private oyster ground now reopened for commercial fishing. The state says safety tests show there's no problem here. But these veterans have their doubts, and they say it's not just here.
Pretty much everywhere we've been, everywhere we checked, same thing.
What also really concerns them is what they're not seeing when they take a closer look at these oyster shells. Usually this time of year they are full of little baby oysters. Instead they're finding empty shells like this and this one, which means the babies have died, and that, they say, does not bode well for the future of this industry.
Right now, Louisiana oyster reefs are comprised of private and public ones. The public grounds are controlled by the state and remain shut down. But close to 40% of the private grounds are now open, like this section owned by Nick Zarak. But he says given the conditions of the oysters, he will not sell these.
But I'm scared because all this black stuff on oysters, I'm scared to sell them.
That uncertainty over what is on the oysters and what may have penetrated them that has these fishermen against commercial fishing of oysters until they get more answers on the potential harm of eating these.
And state wildlife officials maintain any area reopened underwent a series of safety tests before, and nothing came up negative. They say they don't know the long-term implications of the oil spill, but they encourage fishermen to report if they see anything unusual to the state Wildlife and Fisheries Department.
Their livelihoods, not to mention the health of the people across this country, obviously depends on making sure that folks can trust the seafood coming from the Gulf, trust that it's safe, as it always has been.
A toxicologist out of Florida found that some of these chemicals are in great excess of risk-based lethal level.
We are going to keep on monitoring this to make sure that everybody's favorite seafood from the Gulf and favorite recipes are going to be treated, are going to be just fine.
A toxicologist out of Florida found that some of these chemicals are in great excess of risk-based lethal levels, that the current hydrocarbon levels are capable of sterilizing our fisheries and estuary production zones.